Buongiorno, salam, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adel Hamazia. I'm an associate fellow with the Chatham House MENA program, and my claim to fame is that I'm a good friend of ISPI's. I'm incredibly delighted to welcome you all to today's ISPI Med webinar event, the GCC at 40, Prospects and Challenges on the Path of Recovery. So the event is organized within the framework of the 7th edition of the Rome Med Dialogues, which is going to be held, we hope, inshallah, in person from 2nd to 4th December. And now, before sort of introducing our wonderful speakers, our incredible panel, some housekeeping and a very brief event intro and some context, if I may. So the event is being held on the record, is being recorded. Alongside Zoom, it is also being live streamed on the Med website, I believe on YouTube as well, and also on ISPI's Facebook and Twitter profiles. A recording will be available following the event on the Med website, and I ask attendees to submit questions throughout the event using the Q&A function or other comment section. So right away, marhaba, please do. And of course, feel free to share your name and affiliation. So some brief context, a mini chronology. So the GCC celebrated its 40th birthday last Tuesday, Eid Milad Sa'id to the GCC. The charter having been signed on the 25th of May 1981 at Abu Dhabi's Intercontinental Hotel, the HQ located, of course, in the largest member state in its capital in Riyadh. The population in 81, I was checking last night, was around 15 million, believe it or not, quadrupling over the past 4 decades. So birth rates plus that little thing called imported labor, of course, responsible for these numbers. And while the establishment of the GCC in 81 had been preceded by meetings in the mid-70s, 75 in Jeddah, 76 in Muscat, and of course those included Iran and Iraq, may I add, it was just years after independence for many of their members. So there's some what could be described as tectonic events across the region, which really served as a catalyst for the formation of this entity, GCC. So these events included, of course, the Iranian Revolution, Egypt's at the time treacherous peace treaty of Israel. God forbid anybody should normalize of Israel in March 79, which of course led to a decade-long expulsion of Egypt from the Arab League, the seizure of Mecca in late 79, and perhaps most importantly, the Iran-Iraq war, which began in earnest in 1980. So throughout the past 4 decades, we've had several events and movements which have tested the limits of the C and GCC cooperation within the bloc. And these have, of course, been both exogenous and endogenous. So let's quickly revisit just a couple of, just a few key moments. I'm going to run through these. 85-86 oil price collapse. Invasion of member state Kuwait in 1990, followed by a decade of relatively low oil prices. Succession issues, family issues in the mid-90s in one of the Gulf states. 9/11, 2003 invasion of Iraq, some offering space, some against. And then, of course, run up to, of course, the big one, of course, the Arab Spring. We can come back to the Peninsula Shield deployment later. And then, of course, run up to and the aftermath of the JCPOA in 2015. We had the intra-GCC diplomatic rift in 2014. And then, of course, the more significant, profound dispute in 2017, 3.5-year boycott, or depending on your language, some people would call it a blockade. So here we are almost 6 months after the Al-Ula Declaration, with a cold reconciliation between Qatar and UAE and Bahrain on the one hand, slightly warmer engagement between Saudi and Qatar, Vienna talks underway. We have the dual challenges of the pandemic, the energy transition, and so on and so forth. And finally, worthy of note, lurking in the shadows are these sort of long-held territorial disputes, which the GCC has played a role in. So today we'll sort of take stock of achievements, challenges, a roadmap, potential synergies ahead. I was speaking with a friend a few months ago in anticipation, thinking about GCC at 40 and all the various dates in the calendar. And he joked, American friend, that the GCC is suffering from a midlife crisis and maybe needs to go back to school or go back to uni. And I quipped, maybe vocational qualification could be necessary or value adding. And perhaps rather than a diet, expansion could help maybe put the capital C back into cooperation. And on the letter C, just a few to always think about: consumer markets, competition, comparative advantage, conflict, contradictions, controversy, and so on and so on and so forth, right? So the format for today is more of a conversation style. Think of us all being a cafe in the sun. We'll start with a little bit of a conversation around achievements. Then we'll go on to challenges, shortcomings, obstacles to closer cooperation, and then we'll think about the possibilities and roadmap ahead. So please start piling in any questions. I'm very pleased to say we have a blockbuster panel. We're covering a lot of mileage, literally and metaphorically. So DC to London via UAE to Tokyo, right? Very anti-Green Deal. So Dr. Abdullah Ba'boud, who is a visiting professor chair of the state of Qatar, I believe now at Waseda University. We have Dr. Alham Fakhru, senior analyst of the Gulf states at ICG, the International Crisis Group, and Dr. Karen Young, who is senior fellow and director of the Economics and Energy Program at the Middle East Institute. So Abdullah, if you could kick us off, could you sort of, as far as regional organizations go, what have been the main achievements of the GCC from a political and functional perspective, and anything on origins that I missed? And if you could also, since you have a professor title, could you give us a grade, you know, A, B minus, C plus? Where is the GCC at 40? Over to you, Abdullah.
The last question is the most difficult question, but thank you, Adel, for this invitation for ISPA for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be with this very distinguished panel. And friends that I've known for a long time and always value their insights. Adel, when we talk about the GCC, what is it? It's a regional organization that was, as you said, created in 1981 because of the dynamics of the region. You know, those Gulf states obituary have been written a long time ago that they were going to disappear after the British withdrawal. However, what we have seen is a lot of resilience that has happened, and that to a certain extent, some of it is due to their cooperation and to the GCC itself, but that's not the only reason as well. And the GCC was also created because of fraction or problems in the Arab regional system. And that is the Arab League, as you correctly said, with the Egypt peace process and the movement of the Arab League from Cairo, etc. So there was a problem with the regional system within the Arab League. So these monarchies got together. Initially, the idea was to include other countries like Iran and Iraq, as you correctly said, and even Yemen was considered to be part of that. However, it ended up by being an exclusive club of monarchies in the Gulf. Of course, if you want to compare it to the Arab League and to the Maghreb Union, then you would give it a higher grade. If you were to compare it to other regional organizations, then I would be hesitant to say that it will not get above C. But of course, there has been, we shouldn't really just disqualify what has been achieved. There has been a lot of achievement in this regional cooperation. Obviously, the most achievement from, at least my perspective, is the creation of what is known as the Gulf identity. And the idea that we all here live in this area together, and we have shared common interests and common values. And of course, because of that, we also have similar views to, the politics and the economics and what challenges we are facing. Although it was created for security reasons, it ended up being more of an economic integration. And that is always the case in any regional organization. It's always the easiest way, and to start with the lower, low at the ladder, and then climb up. So we've seen there has been a number of economic agreements, which I'm sure my colleagues here will talk about. But in terms of politics, there was a lot of political cooperation as well between the Gulf states in terms of, their standing in and views and political issues in the region, whether it's the Arab-Israeli conflict, whether it's with Iran. But, of all political points, they had kind of a similar understanding, and they represented themselves jointly in international fora, the United Nations, the Arab League, etc. And most important, I think, is they have acted as a group negotiating with the EU, with the United States, with China, and trying to form some kind of a free trade agreements, which of course many of them have not succeeded, but there were some success. At least there was a free trade agreement signed with certain countries, but at the moment, the major countries have not, they haven't been very successful with that. They have also created, security architecture, which is the PSF, the Peninsula Shield, and they have also created a central command, etc. Now we can question how effective they were. That is a different matter. But overall, they were moving slowly in the right direction, trying to create some kind of a momentum to create a regional organization that encompasses, these countries that they share those common values and common threats and common challenges. And they were trying to work with together. And regional integration is never easy, even in the European Union. It's always fraught with problems. And I think in the Gulf states, the problems are, of course, even more because of the nature of the politics in this region. I don't know how long you want me to go on for.
No. Before I sort of ask Ilham or Karen if they want to sort of add to any of these particular points, if you could just say maybe something. So on the political systems point, the fact that they had similar political systems, one of the reasons why they came together. Is it fair to say that there was a resilience capital that came with the organization over the 40 years, even if there were ebbs and flows, ups and downs? Or do you think on the grand scheme, maybe some other trajectories, counterfactuals could have led us to a better place?
Well, I think that political system obviously has always been played that it is the reason that these Gulf states stay together. And I would like to question that as well, because I think that political system has also created some of the problems in the region, because we are talking about monarchies here, about royal family, tribal system. And these tribal systems and royal families have also they came to the organization with a baggage of feud and rivalries and disagreements, and not only between the ruling elites and the ruling families themselves, but also border disagreements and historical antagonism, and of course dynastic rivalry that has been going on. And I think this is as plagued to the GCC movement towards more, functional organization, and delayed their integration process, because, you've mentioned, the conflicts that has happened within the organization. There is a lot of mistrust because of that. There is a lot of, bad feeling, and unfortunately, they have not been able to leave that baggage behind when they enter the organization. The organization is very much a club of monarchies that is exclusive, and also there is no kind of interjection of political forces or of course the population. They hardly play any role, and there is no consultation as well. So it's a very much an intergovernmental, inter-elite cooperation project.
Thank you so much, Abdul. We'll come back to sort of challenges shortly, but if we could stick on the positives, at least at the beginning. Ilham, could you take us through a little bit on achievements from a security perspective? And I know you had a few points perhaps on the origins, anything that wasn't touched upon.
Sure, thanks, Adil. It's great to join you here today, and great to be in the company of colleagues and friends. So I'll say a few words as well, just to add to what Dr. Abdullah mentioned on the founding of the GCC. So certainly it was founded in the context of several regional upheavals and crises, including the Iran-Iraq war, including the Iranian Revolution. But certainly these weren't the only factors that were the cause of the GCC coming together. This desire to create a Gulf identity, as Dr. Abdullah mentioned, was absolutely part of it. It's enabled the leaders to project a separate sub-identity that was complementary but still different to just Arabness. I think we take for granted today the fact that we can speak of the Gulf as a category of its own, but that wasn't really the case back then. And founding the GCC, establishing it, helped kind of project the sub-identity. Arab unity as well. I think if we remember, just 10 years prior, the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar had been in talks. Well, the 7 states that now form the UAE had been in talks to form a single union, and that hadn't happened. But speaking of integration in a regional type forum was still very much on the agenda. So it's part of a history of regional efforts at regionalism as well. I'll move to areas of cooperation and security. The most successful area of cooperation in the GCC has been in economics, but you know, in the area of security as well, it's been kind of mixed. These are states that are highly concerned about their security, but the main model for security in the Gulf, from the independence of the smaller states until today, has been to export it to larger powers, and to the US in particular, not on a regional basis as the GCC, but on a bilateral one-to-one basis. And if you look at kind of the scale of US foreign troops in the Gulf, the extent of this model becomes clearer. There's about 7,000 US troops in Bahrain, around 13,000 in Kuwait and Qatar each, and in the UAE about 5,000. So regional security integration, either between the GCC countries themselves or between the GCC as a unit and the United States, has taken a backseat to this kind of bilateral security relationship with the US. The other factor really hindering security cooperation is the issue of a lack of supranational powers. The GCC is more of a forum for consultation and coordination between the member states, but there's a lack of powers supranationally as such, which means that it can't really act beyond that capacity. But having said that, I think it would also be mistaken to dismiss cooperation entirely. There have been points of cooperation in the area of security. And some of these do also reflect US concerns in counterterrorism in particular, kind of in view of that bigger model that I just mentioned. So several landmarks. In the year 2000, there was a joint defense agreement committing all GCC member states to the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. There was a counter-terrorism strategy jointly in 2004. And in 2006, a permanent committee for countering terrorism was also created. So a lot of terrorism cooperation. But I think the most significant area where they came together in security was the creation of the Peninsula Shield Force in 1984, quite early on. This is oriented towards combating external military aggression. It has about 40,000 soldiers. And Peninsula Shield has been deployed 3 times. In the history of the GCC. The first time was to help liberate Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion of 1990. The second time was to protect Kuwait after the 2003 Iraq invasion by the United States. And the third time, and really most notably, was to assist Bahrain during the 2011 uprising. GCC Peninsula Shield units were deployed to guard the vital installations, to free up capacity of local police forces to manage the protests. Now, GCC defense cooperation, I think it's important to point out as well, it's persisted even at periods of peak crisis. So even during the 27 fallout between Qatar and its neighbors, there still was some low-level cooperation, which is important to note. I think it indicates a sense of resilience, even though what we're talking about is fairly minor. I think it's important to note that it has been resilient. During the height of the crisis, Qatari military forces were conducting joint military exercises as part of Peninsula Shield. And there were as well the annual summits that were still happening diplomatically as well. So I think, that's kind of most of what I want to say.
Most of the good stuff.
All right, yeah. It's, I think it really depends how we evaluate this again. And there's been a lot of discussion of how do we evaluate the GCC. If we want to compare it to something like the EU, then of course we're going to be very critical. But if we think of it more as a forum for consultation and one in which economic cooperation has been more successful, I think we can be kinder to its accomplishments.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. I think one thing, I know Abdullah did an MBA, so the balanced scorecard of pole, econ, and security might be an interesting way to look at this. But Karen, Abdullah rightfully sort of pointed to the economic wins. You've lived in the UAE. We've all spent time in the Gulf, or we're from the Gulf. We've lived in the Gulf. The skyscrapers that were that are there today were not there in '81 in most of the states. The development has been phenomenal, incredible. Nobody could even have dreamt of what some of these oases looks like, for all of the negatives and the positives. What have been the achievements in the economic realm? Could you take us through some of these, Karen?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Adil, and great to be with you all. I guess I have to fall back on more. I mean, Elham and Abdullah have both sort of reinforced this idea that the economic linkages have been more successful. But in my mind, actually, the success of the organization is really more on these sort of normative and intangible features, which is, the sense that these systems of governance, this family rule, this club of monarchies, as Abdullah said, has shown to be legitimate, and they reinforce each other's legitimacy. And so, in the early 1980s, the beginning of 10 years of the state in some places, this was really important, and that has endured. And so that has allowed this kind of sub-identity to form, but also has allowed some learning to continue, and learning in terms of shared patterns and ideas of development, shared ideas about, is it possible to have a resource-rich economy, to be dependent on carbon resources, hydrocarbons for export, and to make that work? And, on balance, the answer is yes. We've seen tremendous wealth created in these economies for citizens, the delivery of social services to citizens, the ability to achieve some pretty substantial gains in human development in terms of education, access to healthcare. So from a development perspective, from an economic development perspective, the GCC has done a good job. Now, the organization itself, didn't necessarily say, oh, these are our benchmarks and this is what we're going to do by, 2000. No, I mean, these were generally national development objectives. But the learning that's occurred in terms of comparing, vision plans or, basically sectoral development has been sort of copycatted from one place to the other. So if we think about, where was the first real financial center and banking sector that proved that this location, this geography could be a point of connection? That was Bahrain, right? So Bahrain really developed that idea, proved the case, and then it developed in Dubai. It's trying to be developed in Riyadh. And now in Doha as well. The same thing on tourism, the same thing on logistics, the development of national airlines, the development of ports. These were things that started in, one location and then copycatted to others. And so I think the GCC has proven useful for basically, the transfer of those ideas. Now you get dualities, you get, redundancies. That's certainly true, and that's one on the negative side. But if you think of it in terms of the positive, this has been good. Now, in terms of the common market, the notion that you could have a region which would allow more open trade between borders. The problem is, of course, the GCC states don't necessarily manufacture very much, and so that notion of the agreement has not been necessarily that useful or productive. But in terms of the rights of citizens as investors in the member countries, that's been a pretty big deal. And so when we think about the generation of wealth of family-owned businesses, of the ability to own property and to have rights as citizens across the GCC, as a member, as a citizen of a member state, that's an enormous benefit. Now, of course, it has been challenged, right? And so the longevity and the durability of that right, I think, is in question. But other kind of economic successes with limitations, we can think about the ability to share electricity through the common grid system. Underused, could now still perhaps find some value and some exploitation in a good way. Common rail system also never really got off the ground, but maybe still in the future. But these are essentially economies which copy from each other, learn from each other, and ultimately are competing with each other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen. Abdullah mentioned a moribund organization called the Arab Maghreb Union earlier in the conversation. So intra-regional trade at UMA is 3%, lowest on the planet. Intra-GCC non-oil trade is 10%, right? And this is the point on tradables versus non-tradables. But sort of free for all, and feel free to come in, whoever wants to jump in. On this point of competing visions and redundancies, from a challenges perspective, have we seen more issues as these smaller states have become more assertive vis-a-vis the hegemon, Saudi Arabia? And here what I'm getting at is Vision 2035, Vision 2040, differences in the VAT approach, for example. I've joked with Karen in the past about starting up a smuggling racket where we can buy expensive perfumes in Qatar and sell them in Saudi Arabia, a small markup. Tell me, where is this going? And is there a way that we can think about, commonalities beyond this sort of zero-sum, port capacity beyond what is needed, or is it just the politics stupid?
Well, I think there's a larger point in terms of, where the GCC and these individual economies fit into the wider regional economy and the global economy. And that's really what's different since 1981, right? And so think about, the UAE really as a leader, as both a destination of foreign direct investment in the region, but also as the most important source in MENA of greenfield foreign direct investment. So if you want to think about the growth of the wider region, you look to the GCC. Now, not all have equal capacity, right? And so this is the difference. And the UAE certainly stands out in terms of diversification efforts and in terms of its capacity for the provision of external finance, you could say that. But Saudi Arabia is also a pretty substantial, large economy, and these states, in terms of their political orientation, are more activist in their willingness to deploy resources for political and foreign policy objectives. And we've seen this certainly accelerate since 2011. And their capacity now is rivals that of in many places what China invests in the wider MENA region. So it's nothing to kind of toss aside. These are major players in the Horn of Africa, across the Middle East, Levant, even into Pakistan.
Absolutely. I want to come back to the GCC functionality, and Ilham pointed to something really important, which is the supranational point, and specifically thinking about what we've just seen over the last 3.5 years from January, is the point on specifically this Article 9 of the Charter, right? Unanimity versus majority, substantive. What is substantive really? And on that point, what is sovereignty, right? Al Jazeera, can Al Jazeera do what it wants? So I want to come back to this point. Abdullah, do we need to revisit the Charter? Was it done in a hurry in the early months of 1981? And then after that, I'd like to go to Ilham and talk about foreign policy divergence, because there's this idea that, regional organizations tend to do better when they have a common threat perception, not a divergent one, or at least the priorities are different. Abdullah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Adel. I think the Charter was, as you correctly said, was done in a hurry. There was a window of opportunity for the GCC to be created. If it wasn't for the Iran and Iraq were actually engaged in the war, not only that there was a threat from there, but also that created the window of opportunity, because to have a regional organization that does not include Iran and Iraq, if they were not in a war, it would have been impossible. So while the two protagonists were actually on the war, it allowed the GCC, the monarchies, to get together and create their own organization. So they were under pressure. So they wrote that charter under pressure, and they had like a very small window of opportunity, and they went for it. And I think hats off to them. They did what they could do at that time. You have to also remember it wasn't easy to get 6 monarchies to agree to that charter. What actually should have happened, like other organizations, is maybe after a decade or something, that charter had to be revisited. Like the EU, for example, with new agreements, and so on, and upgrade it to take a stock of realities. That charter stood in time. It was written in 1981 under duress, under pressure, and it stood in time, and it hasn't really developed. And I think this is something that needs to be revisited. The charter basically, as you correctly said, creates the GCC, creates the objectives of the GCC, cooperation, coordination, etc., leading to unity, which, it doesn't spell out what unity means. It also creates the institutional framework, which is the Supreme Council, the head of the states, and the decision-making within the Supreme Council. It creates the Secretariat General, and by its very name, this is the executive board, as it were, or the executive body. It's very much a secretariat rather than a commission like the European Union. It doesn't have any supranational powers, as it were. It also created the Consultative Council, appointed, but was hardly engaged by the member states or by the leaders. It only responds to what the Supreme Council wants it to do. It also created something called dispute resolution mechanism, dispute committee, that was never actually activated. And you would wonder why, because you do need a dispute committee, because there are agreements and there is interpretation, etc., etc. And that dispute committee has never been activated. So I think now, when it's 14, facing its midlife crisis, as it were, I think it's maybe a good time to revisit this and to see, is this constitution or charter still relevant to what we want? And are they, things have changed, not just the political landscape, but also domestic issues. People have become more educated. There is young, aspiring people, and they want some share in what is going on. The countries in the region are also moving more towards constitutional democracies in one way or the other. We're seeing elections, shura councils, parliaments, etc. Why not have similar thing, for example, within the GCC and involve young people? Why does it just stay to be a very exclusive club, not just amongst the monarchies, but also amongst the royals themselves and the heads of tribes? I think we need to move beyond that, because the GCC states now are modern states. Helped thanks to oil and gas, they've created a fantastic infrastructure. There is potential in terms of business and economic integration, but at the top, they are still kind of stood in time, very much like the Middle Ages. And I think we need to move beyond that and to move to a real modern state. Of course, respecting the system at the same time and the monarchies.
It sounds like there's a Sisyphean struggle between personalization and institutionalization, and paradoxes and cooperative elements. Ilham, could you take us through a little bit around the old adage of there's more that unites us than divides us? How many foreign policies do we have in the region, and what are the key pressure points, if you like?
Sure, Adil. We have quite a few foreign policies, and actually, I think this is a point worth elaborating on. The challenge facing the GCC in terms of the foreign policy differences between its member states. These erupted most visibly in the 2017 fallout, but there were also signs of it earlier in 2014, for example, when Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain all withdrew their ambassadors from Qatar. This was kind of a mini fallout. It was a predictor of things to come, but I think it also shows how things can escalate when mediation doesn't really resolve the problem. But the main issue, really, at least in terms of the Qatar crisis, was for the UAE. Again, each of the three blockading states had their own issues with Qatar. For the UAE, it was Qatar's support for political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood, which it views as a threat. For Saudi, it was also that Qatar was too close to Iran, too independent in its foreign policy. And for Bahrain, Qatar's support for opposition actors in Bahrain. And Al Jazeera, I think, was an issue for all of them. They were all sort of unhappy with its coverage that was fairly critical. Now, in the 2014 crisis, the ambassadors were reinstated. The Riyadh agreement was signed, effectively, whereby all of the states basically promised not to interfere in the internal affairs of one another. But this didn't really solve it. It re-erupted again in 2017 on the same accusations made towards Qatar. Then the list of 13 demands followed that, and this persisted for a while. I think what's interesting to note about this as well is it's one of the first times really that citizens were involved, and it really expanded beyond the state. Gulf governments have had their disputes in the past, but this really filtered down into the media, into the more local level, and overnight the narrative really changed from being this Khalijna Wahid, we are one Gulf, which was really pushed in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. This idea of Gulf unity was really kind of promoted at all levels, and then almost overnight it just became that actually no, we have a problem here. So the issue is not just the dispute between them, of course. It's one thing to have an internal dispute, but also the way in which it was exported further afield to other countries. Places like Libya, Sudan, and Somalia, where the various states backed different actors and different parties along the same lines as the rift. And I think it's worth going into this a bit just to show really the consequences of these foreign policy differences. So in Libya, for example, Qatar, along with Turkey, backed the government of national accord, and the UAE acted in opposition by backing Haftar. In Sudan, following the overthrow of Bashir, who was seen as being too close to the Muslim Brotherhood and to Qatar, the UAE and Saudi then really pushed to gain influence in the country by providing large amounts of aid, effectively, sidelining Qatar in the kind of post-Bashir future. In Somalia, it's the reverse somewhat. Qatar, along with Turkey, are the ones that have really invested there in infrastructure, roads, and ports, and there was also a rift with the UAE and the Somali government over issues I won't go into, but it also pushed the UAE to support breakaway states like Somaliland and Puntland. So across these three areas, you can see the Gulf states take on opposing positions and backing the actors that are aligned to them. And so this has had the effect of deepening conflict in other areas and places outside the Gulf. And I think that's really one of the most dangerous things about this. Is it wasn't just within the Gulf; it exported beyond that. I mean,
can we come back to the big I, not Israel but Iran after? Karen, I don't want to straitjacket you with the economics. I know you've got a lot to say on the FP as well, but could we just come back to a couple of the challenges around on the economic front? So we're dancing between sectors. So the central bank and the single currency, this idea of a Khaliji, not a euro. I'm sitting in London with a sterling post Brexit, though it's not doing too bad, may I add. And also, any of these sort of other areas where you think there were big misses, if you like, from an economic standpoint, as it were.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that the failure to create a shared currency was a miss. It was probably a good idea, but there was momentum, and through the 2000s that there could be this shared currency, that there would be one central bank. These are all economies that in some way have a restricted monetary policy in that they either have the value of their currency tied to the US dollar, in the case of Kuwait, where it's tied to a basket of currencies and the price of oil. And so already, there's a pretty, strict not a lot of maneuverability in terms of monetary policy. So a common currency wouldn't necessarily make that better. In fact, it might have created more volatility in whatever gold currency compared to
Karen, could you speak to the central bank point as well, just for those?
Yeah, so I mean, the main reason that it failed was really more political, in that the states didn't want to cede authority, to have the capital, so to speak, or the monetary capital of the GCC in Saudi Arabia. The UAE didn't like that, and of course the Omanis were kind of cold to the idea in general, and so we're not really interested in that much integration, so to speak. So that's why the common currency never succeeded or never became policy. And I think it's pretty much off the table now. It's not, we've gotten to a point where economic policy across the 6 states have so much variation And that's because, the fundamentals of their economies are very different. In terms of demographics, simply the size of the number of citizens that have to be taken care of, and what resources states have to give services and benefits to citizens. And that's really where we see differences happening. And so that creates different pressures in terms of, how open economies might be in terms of rights of foreign investors, rights for property ownership, sort of tearing down some of the commercial agency structures, which were basically development policies of the 1960s and 70s that said, hey, you foreign business, bring your franchise, bring your manufacturing, whatever, but find a local partner. And in that way, we will generate wealth for citizens and make them owners of business, which has been pretty successful. But in the long term, 40 years later, it's not really necessary anymore in terms of, generating wealth for individuals. It's also pretty counterproductive for outside businesses.
Absolutely.
And so that's coming to a close. And so now the competition between states is really more on deregulation. It's a mess in some ways. We've seen some punitive policies this year. Saudi Arabia rolled out its headquarters policy, which was very interesting in sort of putting a stake in the ground and saying, if you want to do business in the kingdom, you foreign company need to create your regional headquarters here and be committed to being with us in terms of having a physical infrastructure, hiring local citizens. And that has softened even since the announcement.
And Karen, on that point, just to link it back to the Qatar crisis issue, how do investors sitting in the US, whether it's New York or Minnesota or wherever, how do they view this sort of rift of, where does this leave confidence in terms of the investment landscape? In terms of, you can't operate here if I'm operating there, and that's sort of what, quite frankly, value judgment from me, childish and self-defeating behavior.
Well, I think as Elham pointed out, there were very real foreign policy differences that, led up to the 2014 dispute and then more severely in 2017. So I don't want to just push them away as if they weren't significant. They were and continue to be significant. But the GCC states as an entity really kind of shot themselves in the foot with some of the policies that unwinded in terms of, the whole point of having citizens of the 6 member states being allowed to have bank accounts and own property and own businesses and have the same rights as citizens was just completely eviscerated. And so the seizure of assets by the central bank in the UAE of depositors and entities from outside really sent, I think, a lot of shockwaves into investor markets and for GCC citizens going forward. How willing will you be to put your nest egg across the border within the council, knowing that you might not get to see it, or you might not be able to sell your asset, or you might not be able to access funds. So that was pretty severe. I think from a foreign business perspective, it created a lot of confusion and sort of, again, more redundancy. So you've got to have an office in each capital. You're basically then, fighting for a very small amount of market share. If you do business with one state, are you going to be kept out of opportunities in another? And the rules were not clear, right? So it became a lot of just sort of guessing. Well, if I warm up here and have a relationship, and is that going to keep me from winning deals in another location, in another state? And I think some of that sentiment is still around. And you'll still hear people, individuals, very cautious, well, I don't know if I want to be associated with X project or have my name on the front page, because then it might, jeopardize other relationships. And that hasn't gone away.
Absolutely. If I can ask colleagues now, I know it's very difficult because your depth of knowledge, but quick questions, quick answers, because the people have started to warm up. So Abdullah, Ilham, whoever wants to sort of take this one on. We have, as you all know, tectonic shifts last year, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, normalizing with Israel, despite a previous commitment to the Arab Peace Initiative. And then, of course, we have other states which are either reticent or, in the case of, for example, Kuwait, at parliament level, completely against normalizing. I'm adding to the question here. Could you say a little bit about what this peace dividend looks like? Or is there a little bit of embarrassment after what we've just seen with the annihilation and demolition of much of Gaza? Abdullah, you're on mute. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, let's call things by their proper names. I don't think this is a peace agreement. I think these countries, Bahrain, especially in the Gulf, if we're talking about the Gulf, but even in the wider Arab region, they are not at a war with Israel. I think these are completely different. We should look at them completely different from peace agreements. It's normalization of and maybe just making something more obvious that was actually covered under the table, because the relationship between some of these states and Israel have been going on for a very long time. There is a lot of cooperation between the two. The question is why now, and what is the benefit for these countries or for the region? I think why now, because of there's change in the global political system with the changes that are taking place, but also in the regional system. There was a push, of course, from the Trump administration towards that. There is a fear from re-emergent Iran, etc., and there is a fear. There is a belief that perhaps Israel would come to support these countries in their conflict with Iran, whether military assistance or other intelligence, etc., and equipment and sophisticated equipment. But it does not really tackle, these agreements do not really tackle the main issue, which is, the Palestinian-Israeli question. And that is really what is the matter. And without that, it's always going to flare up, as we've just seen in Gaza, and it will embarrass these countries. And we've seen how embarrassed they were. Saudi Arabia, basically, that was reticent and of course, signing the agreement, but it wouldn't have happened, I think, without a nod from Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, at least, and many other opinions. They stopped. There was an acquiescence from them, and they stopped the flights. They've allowed Israeli flights, but they stopped it because of Gaza. And there were some really very damning messages that came from UAE as well, vis-a-vis how Israel is treating Jerusalem and the people in Sheikh Jarrah, etc. So I don't know what the benefits are. I think this is going to put the leaders in a very difficult situation with their population as well, because I don't think they have public support, despite the fact there is a lot of push towards making sure that the public is behind them. Maybe there is some security gains. Maybe there is an insurance policy and a key to enter into DC and get what you want in terms of security arrangements, and maybe buying some sophisticated equipment from DC, like the F-35, etc. But
thank you, Abdullah. Thank you, Abdullah. Because we have a few minutes left, if we could sort of quick fire. Ilham, could you, in a minute or two, just tackle the very easy, simple issue of Quo Vadis? Where are we going with Iran? And what would a JCPOA 2.0 or plus look like, with throw in ballistic missiles, throw in regional issues, and all the rest of it, and if they were to have their cake and eat it? What Karen disagrees, and I agree with Karen, but where are things going from a GCC perspective on that ticket?
Sure. So when the JCPOA was first signed, the Gulf states articulated, well, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they articulated several concerns, primarily that it didn't take into account either Iran's ballistic missile program or its regional power projection in places like Iraq and Lebanon, and most concern to Saudi and Yemen. So they felt that this was totally lacking, and I think that's still where they stand. It's not that they're necessarily opposed to the agreement. It's just that they would like to see these issues included in it. For the US, this isn't really on the table. They see the JCPOA as tackling the nuclear issue and then, opening the door to subsequent agreements if that happens. But it's really a nuclear-focused issue for them. I think the fact that Saudi and Iran are speaking in Baghdad, that there are talks going on there, is extremely positive, and hopefully that can yield consensus on issues like Yemen. I think it's
perfect segue. Karen, two things, if you could sort of touch on it in very briefly as you can. Very simple, easy topics. Where are we going with Yemen? What next for Yemen? What role for the GCC? And more broadly, maybe we can bring in Syria into this. And are there wins for the GCC at post-war reconstruction level? What does burden sharing look like on the economic front?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of talk now about creating more of a development or humanitarian mechanism for post-conflict reconstruction, led or integrated through the GCC in Yemen and perhaps in other geographies as well. I'm not very optimistic about that. Firstly, because of the way that humanitarian aid has flowed from the GCC states into all manner of conflict, but particularly into Yemen. It's been strongly controlled, but also really even isolated from multilateral systems from the international aid community. So the idea that all of a sudden the GCC could become the vehicle or the vector for shared resources, I don't see it happening. I think it's a nice idea, but I think it's not practical. And in terms of Syria, same thing, even worse, right? Because the way that the opportunities that will be created in terms of contracting firms, construction firms, whatever, they have very specific constituencies of people who want to win those awards, and that's going to be a tight race.
Thank you so much, Karen. Abdullah, I got a question, anonymous question, and if you could touch on this. As you've seen, there's been a lot of Oman were bellwethers in the space, as we know, but almost everybody's a mediator nowadays in the Gulf, right? From Kashmir to Darfur back when, and so on and so forth. So one of the questions is, how could Biden's foreign policy approach towards MENA, which prefers diplomacy over the use of force, but also deprioritize the region compared to other theaters, the Indo-Pacific, New Term, and Europe, how can this impact GCC's diplomatic and mediating role in the future?
As you know, it's always, small countries sometimes find themselves there, not necessarily without agency. They try and create some soft power for themselves, and mediation is one way of doing that. So we've seen, especially the small countries in the Gulf, Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar, in particular, playing a lot of mediation efforts in the region, and I think they have done, to a certain extent, a great job in terms of, at least helping to resolve some of the crisis. And I don't think that is going to stop. I think that is part of the way that they see they project their own power, or at least the soft power. And I think now with the Biden administration new policy towards the Middle East, there is a room for these countries to do more. And we see that, that this is really taking place. As you know, we're just talking about Yemen. We've seen how Oman is playing a very important role in that. We've seen the UN representative and US representative to Yemen are actually flying in and out of Oman. We've seen how Qatar has also been doing a lot of good stuff, even with the United States and Afghanistan. We've seen also Kuwait trying to do this. I think this is going to continue, and I think the more diplomacy we can use in the region, I think the better, because only through dialogue and diplomacy and negotiation that we can resolve our conflict. And we don't need wars. We don't need any more conflict, because it's very costly, and the region is facing huge challenges in the future. And the last thing they want to go for is, this prolonged conflict that wastes these resources for no end. And we've seen, that the region actually is suffering because of that. And given, of course, all these visions that these countries want to do, and the development and the fact that they want to create jobs for their young population, they really need to change. They need a paradigm shift in the way that they start to look into this. And I think mediation is one way, and negotiation, of course, and diplomacy should be supreme in the region. It should be supported.
Thank you, Abdullah. Before going to Ilham on a Turkey question, if I may, Abdullah, if you could give us a yes, no on the following. Full disclosure, you're from Oman. Protests going on. We know about the economic situation or the macroeconomics. Karen would speak to debt profiles and so on and so forth. But it's a question that was sort of going on and on under the late Sultan Qaboos. With his successor in place now, and with potential financial support going forward from Gulf brothers, neighbors, do we see potential redux or, I don't know, je ne sais quoi of a reform of the Oman's foreign policy profile, or neutrality becoming not so neutral anymore, as a sort of quick yes, no on that, Abdullah?
No, I think Oman will continue to do what it does, because I think this is its role, and this is how it sees its role in the region. And it's really involved in this omni-balancing game that has always to balance off regional powers and try to create peace and so on. So I don't think it might change at the edges and the way that they do it and the style, but the content will stay the same. It's also Omani culture as well, and the history of the country that try and avoid conflict and try to mediate and create peace and tranquility.
Thank you, Abdullah. Ilham, Turkey have an agreement with the Kuwaitis, military or defense agreement rather. They have a base in Qatar, which of course was, to the chagrin of fellow colleagues who, the crisis in 2017. What is Turkey's role in the region? We're seeing some quasi-rapprochement around the region. Where is this going?
We are. I think this is very positive. We are seeing a move towards diplomacy in general. Relations between Egypt and Turkey have improved. I think if we just look at Saudi Arabia, the Turkish foreign minister visited last month. So did the Qatari emir. Talks with Iran, talks as well, diplomatic engagement with Syria. I think that in itself tells us that there is more of a shift towards diplomacy, and that being taken seriously as an option by regional actors. That's the shift, I think, not just in the Gulf, but a bit broader than that, which hopefully we'll see more of.
Thank you so much. Karen, I know you've done a lot of excellent work, and I'll plug your tracker, but on aid and investment in places like the Horn, Egypt, and many of the places absorbing regional rents from 2011 onwards, and of course before, how has that changed over time in terms of aid coming with conditions, or cooperation and competition in the aid space? Whether it's Qatar's 500 million to Gaza, or UAE and, of course, Saudi, Kuwait with Egypt, and so on and so forth. How is this evolving or developing?
Well, I mean, these are tools that these states now are more willing to use, right? The question is, do they have the resources to, extend them externally, or is there more competition to put them at home? And so I think the next, couple of years are going to be very interesting. Maybe we're getting into the last super cycle of oil prices. Oil prices are going to go up. They're going to have a little bit more in terms of fiscal space or budget to either move towards those diversification goals, or to achieve foreign policy goals, right? You can't do everything. So I think that's really the question for, the next, 2-5 years, and how this unfolds. And certainly there will be a wider variation in ability and resources. So what Saudi Arabia and the UAE can do, what Qatar can do, is very different than what Kuwait or Oman or Bahrain can achieve.
Thank you so much, Karen. As always, questions start piling in at the end, but we do have a relatively hard stop. Just for full disclosure, we have questions on China's role, the C word that we can never forget, and the role of the Belt and Road, greening the Belt, and the role of the Gulf states, so mostly signatories, but also questions on on Turkey and dispute resolution. But if we could end, if okay with our speakers, just in your sort of 1 minute sort of final thought, if you could provide us with one, either a lesson or a takeaway or a suggestion in the game of policy prescription for the GCC as it's entered its 5th decade, what could bring together these countries for better? And I'll end with a quote from myself before passing it on to Abdullah, and we'll go the same. Sheikh Zayed opened the first 40-minute summit of the GCC with the world. What the Arab world expects of us is serious solidarity, cooperation, and loyalty. Abdullah, what can be done to sort of close ranks on Sheikh Zayed's words of wisdom and aspiration back when?
Yeah, I think what is needed beyond, of course, revising the charter and doing all the work that is needed, is we need a GCC champions. We need some leaders who actually believe in regional integration. We need to define what does it mean. Do we follow the EU model, or do we create our own? Do we want to be Eurocentric, or create an indigenous cooperation? We need the Konrad Adenauer, the Jean Monnet, and of course we need the Gasperi and the Spinelli of Italy to lead this further. And unfortunately, we don't have that. We have very conflicting, big conflict between the leaders. Despite Al-Ula, there is still a lot going on, unfortunately, under the surface. And until that has happened, and we have someone like Sheikh Zayed and some of the founding fathers, we're going to be in the same place, unfortunately.
Thank you for that wonderful note. Stop being sarcastic. Thanks, Abdullah. Ilham, over to you.
That's a wonderful grand vision that I can't beat. So I think I'll try to contribute in a more technical micro way. I think we should strengthen GCC dispute resolution mechanisms in the charter and really ensure that those are strong and that they're followed rather than being ignored at every crisis. Strengthening the role of regional mediators as well, maybe having a separate forum for this kind of thing. At the technical level, just doing what we can to improve integration and mediation.
Thank you so much, Ilham. Karen, last words to you.
I guess I don't really see more integration as feasible. I mean, given the current kind of national political systems. But I think one way that could be strengthened and to avoid some of the conflicts we saw in 2017 is to uphold the rights of citizens in member states. I think that would be the most important and sort of practical mechanism that would at least give people more confidence in their ability to move about and have economic activities that are not wasted.
Thank you, Karen. And I'm going to throw my 2 pence worth in, which is the EU GCC FTA had political and human rights conditionality, and that was one of the sticking points. And of course, we hear from the Biden admin that multilateralism and human rights are back. But on that point, if we want to speak down or encourage colleagues in the region to improve these records, they can't be selective, and they have to be all around the region with no exception. And I think everybody knows what I'm on about there. But on that last point, I'd like to ask you to please consult the ISPI website for upcoming events, including an upcoming webinar on China and the Gulf on June 8th at 10 a.m. CEST Rome time. And in the usual way, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your wonderful questions, though they all started piling in at the end. I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers and friends, Dr. Abdullah, Dr. Ilham, Dr. Karen, and a special thanks to ISPI colleagues, Beatrice, Federico, Valeria, and Annalisa. I wish you all a wonderful week and weekend, and I'm sure we'll be back to do this and discuss everything else under the sun very soon. Thanks so much, and wherever you enjoy the sunshine or at least an opening. Thanks very much. Take care. Goodbye, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. Thank you, everyone.